if you get a terrible response, it's very clear, but it's kind of liberating in the opposite direction, which is like, okay, well, now we should do anything else. Right?
Butterscotch
shenanigans. Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 507 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, I'm the beta emailer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's February 14th, 2020 vibes. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net for monthly donations to help keep the podcast going. And we've got a custom donation with a message, a one-shot. So if you donate just like once, then you can also leave a message. I don't know if that's true of subscriptions, actually.
Maybe the first time you start a subscription, maybe, or something.
Yeah, maybe. But we got one from Degeki, so big thanks to Degeki, who just said, here's to a beverage of choice for each of you.
Oh, thanks.
So, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, so if you're looking to help support the podcast, you can get over to moneygrab.bscotch.net and buy us a coffee or something.
Or you can go buy all of our video games.
Or just buy our games. We do sell other things other than podcast. So this week we are zonked off of our gourds, which is a phrase that's a real phrase that human people say.
Could also be gourded off of our zonks. I feel like
they both feel right,
That's true.
Either way.
Yeah. So we are just careening toward the beta.
Yep.
Yeah, it's Friday right now, and the beta starts on Tuesday. So
on Tuesday,
just for some timing.
Tuesday morning specifically.
Yeah.
Something that's been really interesting about this is, so back when we were working on Levelhead, like you could get through the campaign of Levelhead pretty quick. Mm-hmm. I think like the game's done quick. How long did it take?
43 minutes.
Yeah, 40 minutes, man.
Yeah, that's the whole game. That's the single player part of the game, right?
That is a speedrunner who is honed.
Yeah, it would take me like 5 hours or something.
Yeah,
I could do it a day
to 8 hours.
Yeah. But importantly, like Levelhead, a lot of it was all about like the combinatorial interactions between things that you could just pop right into the level editor and just put them right next to each other. And you're like, yep, that works now. Mm-hmm. Moving on.
Sort of instanced experiences, right? You just like pop there's a little bubble with like a few items in it, and you can just see exactly if that works. You're like, all right, cool. As a dev, it works. Bye. And then you move on, right?
And there were fuckloads of scenarios because it's combinatorial. There were, whatever, a few hundred kinds of things. You could put any pair of those next to each other in a combination. So there's lots of ways things could come together, but you could, anything you could possibly imagine that could have
and because it's UGC, it was very easy to test stuff that we changed by just jumping into user levels as well. Because you just have the users are just generating like a constant stream of combinatorial chaos to just test stuff in. And our QA team was able to like make their own test levels and publish them for different scenarios and stuff like that, right? And that meant that like applying DevOps stuff to Levelhead was one of like the best types of games to do it with.
Oh yeah. Because your total feedback loop is basically
the feedback loop is very small, and
you can make small changes, right? Because the core underpinning of DevOps is make a small change, see it all the way through testing, verification, and deployment, and then testing in the market, right? And you can do that when the changes are small and testable.
So Crashlands 2, by contrast,
it's not the same.
Yeah, because it's one of those things where it's like, any big RPG has this problem, right? Which is, as a dev making it, if you want to ask, like, okay, like is it working, right? It's like, not just on a mechanical, like, oh, did this quest work? But as a player, if I'm 35 hours deep and I hit this quest, has everything I've done made sense up to now? And then,
because on paper, the quest, we can look at our progression map and we're like, okay, like these are the types of things that the player could have gotten up to this point, and so it makes sense to reference this thing over here or to give them this item. But that's on paper, right? And like we don't know if like once you actually play the game, is that the likely path that you actually take? Right. So does that quest actually make sense then in context?
Yeah. So a big part of this past week then, so that's been kind of a hero on all fronts, playing it basically like all the time outside of studio hours, well then during studio time working on it. And a big part of that is like just timing wise. Just
I know everything about the game, and it's taking me like 40 hours to get through. Right? So,
and importantly, you're trying to, because you've already done one playthrough. We talked about that a few weeks ago. In this most recent one, you're doing on the.
Well, I did half a playthrough earlier,
right,
and then we changed enough things from that I was like, I gotta just start over. I think.
So we've done enough, and the things. What's funny about it is like a lot of the tweaks we're making are not. They're just not very big in terms of like actual changes that on the dev side, but the experiential impact on the player side can be very, very large, right? So something as simple as saying, okay, yeah, you have access actually to this thing basically a few beats earlier than the previous can really change the feel of some particular section, either making it like overwhelming or if it was had a bit of a drought before, perfectly paced now, right? And so that's a big part of it is like being able to.
But for me,
oh yeah,
right? Because I'm giving feedback based on how I play the game and how I think it should be based on what my experience was. Mm-hmm. But I'm doing things in a specific way that not necessarily everybody else does or will do, and so we can like make all these adjustments, and it'll feel better for me as a player. But we still aren't quite sure whether that actually was the right move.
So then, this is impacted by everything, right? Because the obvious one is just like how hard is stuff, right? But that's influenced by a million things. But also Sam went and overhauled like where every single resource is basically, right?
Basically.
In the first biome. Because we just realized like as the game went on that stuff kind of had a more of a, we liked the way that stuff was being laid out later in the game compared to earlier in the game. And so
it was a little too chaotic early game.
Yeah. So Sam was like, all right, I'm going to come back through just to overhaul all this, right? But that changes the balance of where the resources are, when you're going to run into them.
So we got to play through it again. Yeah. We got to play through like the whole first act again.
And that's a big challenge with coming into the beta, because the point of the beta is to say, as you were saying, when we make a change, it's because of something we experience, but we don't know what that means for other people's experiences.
Yeah, is it idiosyncratic or is it general? Is kind of always the big
question. If you were like, oh, this was way too easy, so you make it harder, is it because you're an expert at the game and you like hard games, right? Or is it because it's actually too easy for the average intended player experience at that difficulty level? And there's no way to know for those kinds of questions. You just make your best guess. So rolling into the beta, the whole idea here is we need the game to be stable enough that along all those things that can impact the whole gameplay experience, which is every piece of it, so that when we get feedback from testers, we can hopefully make very small adjustments to account for that feedback we're getting. Because if we have to make big adjustments, then those end up kind of untested because it's all happening after the fact, right? So somebody plays through a bunch of stuff, we get feedback being like, oh, this is how I feel about this. And we're like, okay, cool, let's make a change. And we have to hope that some other round of testers haven't hit that content yet, right? So that we get feedback on the new stuff. And if we don't, then we end up sort of leaving hanging a bunch of changes that we think made sense, that we tested, that we feel good about, but that we don't actually know what the player response is going to be.
So I mean, this is the joke about it, right? It's like the most ideal scenario is that you go into a beta and any of the stuff you change is so incremental or small that its impact is obvious, and it's not the sort of thing that post beta you like would have to run another beta or some shit, right? And the problem is that like on the dev side, all of this always from a timeline standpoint means essentially that you basically have to have the game not just done, but iterated on, polished earlier and earlier and earlier in the overall dev process, so that by the time you get to launch, you can have done like an alpha, you can have done a beta, all these things which inject changes afterwards, which then you have to again ask the question, well, do we need to test that? And so you have this like,
fine.
Yeah. And so it is a kind of a funny one where I think for where we're at, we've gotten we both completed the game essentially at this point, right? Everything's in there. And we've made all of the changes all of the bigger changes, like that biome update to the first zone that would have.
Well, but also like this week has seen a ton of new features that now it's like, we got to figure out, we got to play with them. Like we got loadouts this week. Mm-hmm. You can just hot swap equipment loadouts. Didn't exist before this week. We totally redid the fishing game this week. So just all these things, like we don't know what the consequences are going to be. We're making these like, we have a pretty good intuition about what the consequences are going to be, but it's all subject to balance, right? And so we still have to then play through it again.
And significant changes to controls and control options, right? So that a few quality of life features, but controls are how you engage with the game at the most fundamental level.
Yeah,
and
like
so,
we mentioned, we redid the touch controls last week, right?
Yep.
So,
but then added these new concepts too, like where there's like this wheeled queuing concept now, where it used to be that if you tried to switch things that you're wielding while you were in mid attack, it would cancel the attack and switch to that thing right away. And now you have the option of saying, actually, just once that attack is done, then switch to it. Just have that like a setting so that you can like pre-choose what's going to happen next.
Default, I think, because it turns out that
Well, so it was on by default for PC, and I've been playing with it all week, and at least for me, it led to me dying a lot on PC, mostly because I'd be trying to switch to my stun gadget, but it would to stun an enemy, right? Mm-hmm. But it would wait until I finished my current cast, then it would switch, and then it would stun the enemy. And oftentimes it would be slightly too late. But on touch, it's perfect. Like that setting is perfect to have on.
Yeah.
Just
and it
because
also
of the way
might
your
make
thumbs work,
sense to be on chill mode, because people playing in chill mode probably aren't doing really fast combat kind of behaviors, right? Or something. So it's kind of, but this is exactly the problem is like.
But the option is there, right? Yeah. So like you can turn it on or off depending on what you want. But the default choice changes things, and we're not quite sure what it should be.
Yeah, we don't even know what the default should be for certain things, right? And so that's part of what the beta is for too, is to see like go into it basically saying, here's what we think the intended experience is supposed to be for the different difficulty levels, for the different input systems, for the different everything, and then see if that turns out fine, right? And then this is all given that we have 100 random testers who are almost universally fans of the franchise already, because that was why they applied to be testers, right? So we also have a very biased community who's testing this thing for like it was hard to find people who hadn't like played the demo, right? Or even been in the original alpha, because again, like those are the people who are applying for this beta test. And so to top all of this off, we don't have a player pool that is truly representative of like the player pool we'll have once we launch the game.
I think what's so funny about this though is like, because there's a lot of hand wringing, about this. I mean, for us, but for everybody who makes stuff. But it's also true that like you as a person who's making a thing aren't 1,000 other people. So it's kind of funny to like, you know what I mean? To hand wring it all about it at this phase, because it's like we spent 4.5 years making a thing. Like we made it, and it's made for us then in many ways,
Yeah.
And we aren't a whole crowd of like, we aren't the market, so you just can't know the whole time at all.
Well, you got to trust
right?
your taste. But there's something else that happens with these, which we've noticed internally, because we've tasked all of our QA testers to just do a full playthrough of, play it like a player, don't like jump around with developer tools. Don't do targeted testing of quests or whatever. Just like play through it and give us, qualitative feedback on like, how's it feeling? Right. So don't just report like I found a bug and then that's it. Like just tell it, like give us the vibes, and we saw this pattern as well in the closed alpha we did way back in the day. And we're going to see it again in the beta, which is when people are playing in it as a tester, whether it's in a player playing in a beta or an internal QA or whatever, when they first start playing it, they over scrutinize everything, every single thing.
I think it's also just the case for new players, period, because you're unfamiliar. Like that's the difference between games and other media is that you have to learn them.
Yeah,
right?
you're hyper aware of how you are reacting to the game and things that might seem.
I think the testing
unfamiliar
amplifies that, but I think actually. 100%. But I think it's actually still like Sam is right. I think it's mostly just how we all interface with games. It's that in the context of a testing scenario, or if you're a QA on a QA team or whatever, it's you have a person to tell that stuff to who could potentially
ask for it actually
right?
too.
well, that's the thing, because when I think about like when I first played Baldur's Gate, right? It was very unfamiliar like genre of game for me. But when I was playing it, I wasn't thinking, they need to change this. Yep. They need to change this thing. Yeah. This icon is too much unlike the other icons or whatever, right? Like none of that stuff was crossing my mind. I was just trying to figure out the game.
Yeah.
And so, but it's different than like especially like for our internal QA, which is they're very familiar with the game. in terms of like, all the interface. Like they've seen all the creatures and all the biomes and everything. So then when they come through as a playthrough, they're not like trying to figure out how to play the game, and they're not in that mindset. They're looking for like little things that are out of place, right? Because they know what's in place. You know what I mean?
Well, and you're also, once you get past the stuff that you had a reaction to, then you're trying to guess which is what we're doing for design in general, right? Is you're trying to guess who sort of in your mind representatives of your diverse audience are going to be and how they would react to it. Because and you have to, because like Sam, you're right, to an extent, you are like, it has to be designed for yourself, because otherwise you can't design for somebody.
If you play it and you're like, I'm not having a good time.
You definitely
that's the only truth you can really know at first,
Well, I think like an interesting example of it is how like at the very opening of the game, there's a scene where like the camera moves and highlights something. And that type of a thing happens hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the game, where during dialogue or something, the camera will pick an object far away and move over there to highlight it. If a character's talking about something or whatever. And the code isn't highlight.
It just kind of like
it just kind of like gets centered on the screen. Yeah. So the camera just pans over there. And like from our internal playing, we got a bunch of comments on the first time that happens in the game, that like camera moved a little fast there, right? But then the camera moves the same everywhere else. But once you kind of have seen it, then you stop scrutinizing it, right? And so then you just kind of play and you don't even notice how fast the camera is moving. And
I don't think it's about scrutinizing it or not. I think it's a new experience. And because I also think this idea of like,
I think Bryce, that means less scrutinizing, which seems like being like overly attentive on something versus just like, it's just you're noticing stuff, right? Whenever you play a new game, you're like, you're noticing.
Yeah, you're noticing everything. Right?
Because everything's unfamiliar. And so, I mean, I noticed this too. Like when I played, there'd be times where there might be like some resource that is like a bottleneck. And, like I always need more of this thing or something like that. And like early in my playthrough, I was like hypersensitive to that. But then as I got deeper into the game, I would hit those bottlenecks. And then instead I would be thinking about it more like a player. I'd be like, well, how do I get more of that? Let me plant some stuff in my garden, or let me figure out where the best spots are, right? But early game, I viewed it as a problem to be solved as a developer. And then as I got deeper into the game, I was able to pivot to view it as a problem for a player. Yeah,
right. Well, that's the thing, is it's always both, right? Because the problems can be mitigated by different design choices, and it's always, there isn't a clear answer about if there should be some design mitigation, or if it actually is just fine and is part of how the game should be experienced, because players actually have agency and they can do blah blah blah, right? And there's no right answer to any of these ever, and so this is that trying to find that balance between thinking about your own experience, how you experience it when you're doing it as a developer, and you can change things. That's similar to when you're doing it as a tester and can talk to people who can change things. You have similar kinds of reactions to things, but I think really ultimately you still kind of have the same reactions you do as a player, right? Because like when I pick up any game, what I'm actually like, my experience picking up a game is being met with 1,000 tiny confusions, right? Because that's what learning is, right? It's 1,000 tiny confusions of being like, trying to figure out what the patterns are, trying to understand it, because all games are bespoke and they have different, like their UIs are different. Whether or not they actually like react to show you that you've highlighted something, or that, like whether or not you can tell before you click something what it's going to do, all that kind of stuff is fully bespoke to every single game. And so you're met with 1,000, like, okay, you're just guessing about what's going to happen. Every one of those things is a place for, potential enslickening, for potential confusion, for, in our case, potential support tickets that we don't want to deal with.
But I guess
post-launch.
What I'm saying is like when you hand the game to somebody and you're like, test this for me and tell me, what's wrong with it, basically, then there's a bias toward viewing all of those little confusions as
problems,
as blockers that need to be removed instead of just part of the learning process. And so something that you'll kind of see is like when you hand a game to a tester, you will get an absolute torrent of feedback about the first 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly it just kind of drops off because they've figured stuff out, and then they just play the game. Right?
But I still don't think that's That's like true, but it's also not, because the first 30 minutes is where every new thing happens.
Yeah, but I'm saying they're reporting every new thing as if it needs to be different.
No, sure, yeah, that's true. But
even though they just totally figured it out and got
yeah,
through
I mean
it
the
just
drop
fine.
off is because they finished seeing 1,000 new things, and now the newness slows down, right?
Yeah,
Because if they were confronted continuously,
all I'm saying is they're reporting new things as things that shouldn't happen.
Yeah,
when of course they have to happen.
Yeah,
and then once, like you're right, like once they're done experiencing new things, they stop reporting quote problems. But really, the problem was just like I saw something new and didn't immediately know what it was, which is not a problem. It's like it's just what has to happen.
It's not inherently a problem, right? And this is
it can be a problem if you can't figure out what it is and the game doesn't,
And that's the
help
tricky
you.
bit, I think, from a game designer direction standpoint, which is knowing when to say, I know you're a little confused, but that's okay, because you'll
figure it out.
You'll figure it out.
Well,
And being
even
able to
like
trust
the
that-
knowing bit, as you're saying, like because you don't get to know, right? So it's actually it's developing judgment that turns out to give you good results is actually what it is, right? And the good results are what happens at launch, because like we're saying, everything is biased. Every single person's experience is biased because it's their personal experience, right? So it's biased towards their whole thing. So coming into a launch, all we have is this small collection of specifically biased experiences, and we have to use our best judgment constantly to try to guess.
where those lines are, right?
Is this fine? Is this good? Is this bad? Is this intended? Is this not intended, but we think it doesn't matter? Like and you're trying to make those judgments constantly. And again, it's basically almost despite your own experience, where you're like, well, I experienced it this way. There are players like me, but as developers of the game, like nowhere close to, experientially like you, right? And so, and we've been in the trap many, many times of like going too hard into being like, well, here's the list of things people said, so let's just make all those changes. And then swinging the pendulum being like, no, everybody just needs to like, they'll figure it out and it's fine. Yep. And you're just living somewhere in the middle of that space. And everyone's going to have a different opinion about where that is. There's no way to know. There's no way to ever know. And you just hope at the end of it, you don't get too many support tickets and everyone's happy.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. So that's where we're at the beta then is we're trying to pack in as many of these like last minute big things that we can change and still have time to play through them and make sure that was okay before the beta. Because it's not the case that like we can play through the game once and be like, okay, we'll make a couple adjustments here and then we're done. Those adjustments require another playthrough. And then after that second playthrough, it'll probably be like tiny adjustments that don't necessarily require a huge playthrough again.
Well, I think the reality has been, by and large, that the changes we've been making have been small. Even stuff like, it's weird because like the biggest one, the one that freaked me out the most was doing the map update for the first zone, because that to me is introducing a tremendous amount of untested feels into it, right? And granted,
it could potentially impact quest triggers and all kinds of stuff could be impacted.
Yeah. So it feels like if you mess that up, that's a much bigger fundamental change, especially to the early game experience, right? Versus even the changes we did to fishing. We did them. It's like quote unquote, it's a big change in that it's like a different fishing minigame, but at the same time, it's not really that big of a change because it's such a self-encapsulated.
It's easy to test.
Yes.
Yeah. Because, but I think importantly, the change to fishing was trying to solve like a couple of problems at once, which basically just manifested as fishing is boring, right? And there are a lot of reasons why something can be boring. So I think like an interesting example is something like Cookie Clicker, right? Which is not boring and you don't do anything really, right? You just click a cookie and then at some point you spend cookies on things that make more cookies.
Yeah, you're constantly in anticipation for a thing that's just around the corner, and that's why it's not boring, right?
And it's completely enthralling for a little while, right? Mm-hmm. And so even the simplest of things can be enjoyable and interesting and have like mental hooks. It doesn't have to be like a crazy test of skill or whatever. And so where we were at with the fishing it was kind of a combo of like the act of fishing was not very interesting.
Because it was you cast, waited for a little moment.
It was like it was just a
tapped.
timing mini
was,
game,
yeah,
right?
very short
Like you basically wait for the bobber to kind of splash, and then you have like a moment to pull it in.
Yeah, like Terraria style, right? Just like just wait for it to bounce and then pulling it up.
And so, and that also meant that like the amount of fish that you caught was pretty static with each cast. It was hard to fuck it up, so you just kind of always get the fish. And so it's just kind of like, if you wanted to go fishing, it's just like, okay, I'm just going to be like generating fish sort of at a continuous rate, just as long as I'm just casting here, and so we took a look at it and we're like, how do we make this better? And of course we did what we've often done in Crashlands 2, which is let's go back in time and look at what we've done in the past. So we looked at the fishing game for the original Crashlands, and we were like, okay, let's take that as a template and kind of migrate it into the styling and
make it fit,
sort of like just make it fit in Crashlands 2. And we did it, and it's fucking great.
It works great.
Yeah,
but
it works so good.
And again, but you have to look at the backdrop of this, which is like the reason that particular fish, because there's two fishing games, right? So the reason that particular one is a little bit boring is because the other one's really fucking intense. And so it was like.
Yeah, because we have two. Because like in the original Crashlands, you could only fish by casting in like a rippling pool, and you couldn't just cast into open water. You always had to find the pools, little schools of fish. In Crashlands 2, we have two fishing games. We have open water fishing, where you just cast anywhere you want, and you can just pull fish out. But then we also have where there's like the rippling water, the bubbling water. That's where you can catch whoppers. And the whopper fishing game is what we've shown in the trailer, where basically Flux is like going nuts and like wrenching the pole around, and it's like a battle, So it's pretty intense. And then once you reel that whopper in, then the pool is gone. And so one of them you get to do infrequently, and one you can just kind of do wherever you want, whenever you want. Right?
Yeah. So the idea is like when you're looking at how do you think about the balance between those two games, right? From a design standpoint, to allow for someone to be chill or not. That's where the first one ended up being just a very simple, very chill thing, which turned out like just too.
It was too boring because it's that question of like, because we were trying to like mimic fishing, which like the experience of fishing is actually you cast a line,
waiting,
and just sit there, right? And so, but there is a chill coziness to that we were trying to capture with the original minigame, right? But it turned out that in the context of the game, you had a little bit of anticipation for like when it was going to hit. But all you're doing is just staring at the bobber, waiting for that to happen. And then it's a fast reaction so that you're kind of like on edge, but also not doing anything at the same time,
Well, and there's no choice to be made.
There's no choices.
It's literally you wait for the bobber, and then you have to react within that, half a second.
Yeah, that's the whole thing.
Or you just miss it, and then it.
But if
it's almost like boring or too fast. You know what I mean? It's like somehow.
I think it's just one dimensional, where it's like you have one button, like you click and you cast. You have to wait, and you have to click the button when the game says, and so you're not making any decisions, right, about what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, but really, like chill is about kind of low risk decisions, right? About like and getting to take your time, sort of like
it's not chill stuff is not binary. It's not pass fail. It's got shades.
Yeah, it's just a little more chill. So that's what I think, kind of looking back at the original Crashlands fishing game. That was what we realized. We're like, actually, like the reason this is like worked so well is because it's a chill, peaceful vibe where things are kind of moving slowly.
You decide when you're pulling up the line is actually
exactly. You decide when you pull it up, and you're still trying to time it right, and you still like to get it like perfect. You got to like nail the timing, right?
For those who haven't seen the original, we'll describe it real quick. So it's basically you cast your line into the water. And then we pull up on screen an overlay that shows like a side view of the water, so you can kind of see down into the depths.
Almost like you're looking at an aquarium, and there's like different fish swimming around in there.
So your line goes down, and then your line is just chilling at the bottom, and then the fish in the water are represented by these kind of like black blobs,
mysterious blobs.
They're just kind of like drifting around and swimming around, and whenever you click, it yanks the line up, and any fish that are above the line will get caught by the hook, and it'll fling them out of the water. Which actually I think we took from Ridiculous Fishing.
Yes. Yeah.
Where like that one is like you
The
cast
whole
your
game
line
is
like,
about is that
you like down into the depths of the ocean, and then you're pulling it up and hooking fish on the way up, you know, and then whatever. So we kind of like we use that concept. Yeah, and it's like what's cool about it then, like these guys were saying, is like you cast your line and there's no pressure.
Yeah, I think
like
it's confusing timing, right? With with pressure is kind of what happened, I think, with that jump between the first one and the second one, right? Where it's like, you can wait however long you want, and then you decide when you're.
You can just watch the fish swimming around, and at some point you're like, ooh, I think they're lined up nicely, and then you can pull. But if you pull at a different time, you might catch fewer fish, and it's fine. You still caught some fish.
So it is a timing game, but it has no time pressure, and I think it's a weird like stupid nuance that if you're talking about like any particular little game you're making, if you're like, oh yeah, it's like a timing based game, I think it's very easy to do what we did, which is like, oh, it means it's all about doing something correctly at the right time, as opposed to saying is there time pressure where it's like, if you do it at the wrong time, do you fail, or do you have to do it within a certain window, like that sort of thing, right? And
can you try again, right?
Can you try again? Yeah.
So I think that this is a fun sort of design challenge that anybody who then gets the game when it comes out or is in the beta, definitely like just take a beat if you're into game design and just like try the two fishing games of Crashlands 2 and think about that question of like, why do these feel so different when ultimately it's the same game actually. It's just like you just tap a thing at the right time and now you got the
click
fish.
when the thing is lined up, basically.
Yeah. So why are they? But they feel so different, right?
Yeah. But the other thing about it then was like, because the fishing game was so one dimensional like that, then so we have a bait mechanic where like if you use bait, if you craft bait, then you get more fish. Like you can pull more fish up, right? But it made it so that it felt like for me personally, it felt like it wasn't worth fishing unless I had bait, because the fishing was uninteresting enough that I wanted to spend as little time doing it as possible. And so I would go out of my way to make as much bait as I could. I'd spend like hours making bait so that each of my casts,
because that was interesting, even though you could have spent a lot less time just fishing.
Right.
It's kind of like we're talking about programming, right? It's like sometimes you need to solve a problem and you're like, well, I could write a program to solve it, and it might take 5 more hours to do it, but that's a lot more interesting than like filling out a spreadsheet by hand or something. Yeah.
And so, and like the fishing is especially useful for like gardening. Like gardening and fishing in the game are pretty like interconnected with each other and like and stuff like that. And so the fishing is like an optional part of the game that's connected to another kind of optional part of the game, right? You don't really have to do it generally. And if the way that it's balanced and what it feels like to interact with it is pretty flat and not too interesting, then for a lot of people, it'll just kind of like delete this whole section of the game because it's just like,
might as well not have
I don't want to do that.
No, that. But if you are interested in it, then it does this weird thing with the economy where, because you want to get some stuff from these fishing holes, right? If effort-wise, mental effort-wise, if it's kind of boring to do so, then like we have to suppress actually the total effort required in the recipe calculations for things that use those items, because otherwise it's like the effort is baked into the experience of just being bored while fishing and doesn't need to be baked into like how many of them you actually get, if that makes sense. Because essentially it's harder to get them as a player just because it's boring, not because of anything in the game, right?
And we even made adjustments like this to kind of everything, because quite a bit earlier, your telegraphs for your harvesting tools were a lot smaller and it took more hits to chop down trees and stuff like that.
Yep.
And so it meant that just like you would spend more time whacking away at individual trees and it was harder to hit multiple at a time and blah, blah, blah. And with just like a few adjustments to that, like make the telegraph bigger so you can catch more trees at a time.
I think we just reduced the hits by like 1.
It was like 5 hits and now it's 4 or something like that. And then I think we also sped up the swing times.
Sped it up. Yep.
Yeah. And so it's like just little things like that make it so that something goes from being like tedious to being really satisfying. And it's like a razor's edge.
Well, I think it goes back to there's a new puzzle again, which is because it's not interesting to stand in front of something and like once you've stood in the right spot and started swinging more is not interesting, right? Finding the spot is interesting. And so
figuring out how to use your telegraph to catch more things.
Yeah, so making it so the telegraph can, by making it be proportionally like big compared to how far apart things are. And then making it so that now you're just spending more of your time traversing and positioning, which is interesting, rather than standing.
Makes you feel clever,
hitting,
basically, with every single hit, right?
Yeah.
Which is the goal.
Yeah, well, and one of the reasons why there was like a big map update for the first biome is because of that. We're like, when we built the first act, the telegraphs were smaller, and it was kind of hard to harvest things in clusters and blah blah blah. As after we did our closed alpha, after that was when we started building out Act 2 and 3. But we made all those telegraph changes and stuff before we started building the last 2/3 of the game. So the last 2/3 of the game, the resources are distributed in a way that's much more satisfying to harvest because you can line them up. Like they're kind of clustered in little pockets and stuff like that. Whereas in the first biome, there was a lot more like
it's just more
sporadic.
A lot more like spreading individual resource, like one tree just here and then another tree over there, which is actually what the first game looked like because you couldn't cleave things, right? Things were kind of individually distributed. And so a big part of this kind of repass that Sam did was undoing a lot of those like individual sparse things and kind of redistributing the resources to be just more satisfying to harvest. So like everything kind of talks to everything. And even though like Sam spent all day doing these map updates, now he still has to play through it to see is it working? Like
I would say now
it'll be small tweaks, I think, after this. So it's been really interesting just because like in order to get to a point where players can play through the game, we have to just keep playing through the whole ass game. And I think about how like Baldur's Gate took 7 years to make with like 400 people. And given the number of different choices the player can make, say like leading up to Act 3. If they want to make changes to Act 3 and then ask the question, not just like, is this functionally working? Like does this quest lead to this next quest or whatever? But rather like, does this feel right? Does this feel good in context? I don't fucking know how you do that. Like,
ultimately, this is why design is the hard part of everything, is this, right? Mm-hmm. It's also why design, you have to be able to be confident about your ability to design because ultimately you can't test all of it. And again,
there's just no time. There's not enough time.
Testing is always biased, so you still don't know for sure how it's going to hit the broader market because you're trying to make a thing that can be experienced positively on more than average, like most of the time experienced positively by most people who play it, right? You can't possibly know for sure that you're going to hit that. And so you have to be able to have a case where you can be like, well, I understand what's going on well enough that I know if I make this change, here are the things that are going to be impacted. Mm-hmm. I feel like the consequences of that for our target audience, for like the different difficulty levels of the game are going to be good. Or like, oh shit, for people playing in chill mode, that'll have this effect though. So we also need to do this to mitigate this other thing, whatever. You have to know that you have the ability to work through all the consequences of a change because you can't test them all. You just can't. And even if you could, again, you can't test them.
You don't get to know
in the market. It has to.
I think it's one of my favorite stories is still just. I mean, it happens basically with most game launches that go shockingly well. Is the confusion that the devs themselves have about it because you can't know, especially the longer you've been working on something, exactly how well somebody's gonna do, or like you think it, you're like, okay, I think it's working, and then the game like explodes. Yeah, like Balatro was like a fun example. But even I heard this from the director of Elden Ring because like that game just went way bigger than anything they'd done previously. That's
true. That was actually like a sleeper hit, kind of like it was.
Yeah, they didn't think it was gonna. They thought it was just gonna be like better than their previous one, but not.
Well, and like
explosive.
Final Fantasy
Helldivers 2 is another one, right? Where it's like the original.
Helldivers 2.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy 14 is an interesting one because they launched that game to great disappointment. Like they were so like, this is gonna be so fucking good, and the players will play it and they were like, everything about this fucking sucks. and the devs were completely blindsided, and then they listened to all the player feedback, and then they literally just shut the game down.
Oh yeah, they like
I think like a
6
year,
months, right? Yeah, a year.
Yeah, they just completely like, okay, you know what? This one's a mulligan. We're just gonna we're just gonna have a do-over. And we'll relaunch it after we fix everything. So they just kind of like purged everything, started like, they just
that is a true market test. That's the only real market test you could do.
And then after the relaunch, it did so much better than they were expecting. Right. So it was like, you cannot
tell.
know.
And like
at all.
The ones where people just like have, I think the ones where people are overconfident are they're like more common, if that makes sense. I think because since so much hinges on it, there's an outcome you want, of course, which is that like this thing's going to work really, really well. Like nobody doesn't want their game to do that. So I think there's always a mental pull in that direction. But I think the more design work you do, the more you realize that because you just can't know, no matter what, then at least for me, I entered this like I don't know if it's like I wouldn't call it a numb state, but it's like a
Zen state.
Zen state. No, it's not that. It feels very limbo-y because you just got to wait until you launch the game to see what happens because you don't.
You're just kind of idling in uncertainty.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, but I can't.
Yeah, for us, like we know exactly what our lives are going to look like right up until April 10th.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's just a black void.
Yeah.
Like we have no idea what's going to happen beyond that.
Could be terrible. Most likely outcome is it's just somewhere in between, and it's the hardest one for making decisions, right? It's just like, okay, so we don't have
if you get like
if
you get a resounding success that if you do Stardew Valley numbers, you're selling 20 million copies or some shit. Then it's like, okay, I did a thing that people liked. It worked really well. I now have infinite resources and time. If I want to do another thing, it makes a lot of sense to keep going in this franchise or whatever. Right. Yeah, because it clearly worked, right? If you get a terrible response, it's very clear, but it's kind of liberating in the opposite direction, which is like, okay, well, now we should do anything else.
Yep.
Right. Don't make another one of those, right?
Well, maybe you can't. Maybe it also just means, okay, well, now we close the company because we can't.
Yeah, there's
either
clarity.
Way, it's clear. Not necessarily good. I mean, definitely not good if it's a bad launch, right? It's not good, but it is clear what should be.
So it's pretty clear in both cases. But yeah, you're right. Like the middle case where it's like it does fine. That's the one.
The worst one is the low middle case where like you're still fine. But
not that fine.
But not that fine, right?
It did well enough that kind of like you've got a lot of players, but not enough
so
players to support.
But not enough revenue.
Yeah, so it's like you definitely want to figure out how to like roll that player base forward and how to do right by them and like keep the game maintained and stuff like that. But then like it's only an expense that doesn't
become an albatross around
pay
your
off.
neck.
And, yeah. There's just a lot of weird shit that happens when you hit that middle ground, which is why like for me is why I'm in like trying to play as much Crashlands 2 as possible from now until launch. Because I want to, after 4 years of dev, I don't want to face plant 1 inch before the finish line.
Oh, yeah.
But it still ultimately just requires you play testing and then again trying to guess like what does this mean for the real players, the people who experience the game at launch. And it's just guesses. It's ultimately just guesses.
Yeah, and what I'm the most interested in before we get to a question, is because I know we're going to have a lot of people, because this happened in the alpha too, we're going to have a lot of people who are coming from the original Crashlands, where a lot of their feedback will be like ways that they want this to be like the original. Like I think last week we talked about how people often just misremember stuff and they just make stuff up that actually wasn't part of the original, and then it's just how it felt, and then they want that, in Crashlands 2. But from my own experience, even early in Crashlands 2 dev, after playing like the earlier, worse versions of Crashlands 2, when then going back to play original Crashlands, I was like, I can't do this because like the original Crashlands is really, I think it's a really good game.
Yeah.
But then once
Crashlands 2 though. So.
Yeah, but then it feels like Crashlands 2, but just not as good. And if you just play Crashlands 2 and it's been a long time since you played the original, you'll have this kind of like nostalgia. You'll kind of have these like anchor points where you're like, I wish this was more like the original, right? But if you play Crashlands 2 for a little while and then you actually do go back and play the original, all you can think is, man, I wish this was more like Crashlands 2.
I was actually pleasantly surprised when we did the demo. That was one of the strong points to me from doing the demo experience was seeing actually that largely the player response didn't have much of that. Like,
it was rare, honestly.
It was actually very rare.
It happened more in the alpha, in the internal alpha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was before, because like we talked about, a lot of the tuning's been just so much better since then. So
Yes.
yeah.
And the other kind of weird thing is there were like two things that we got feedback about during the alpha that are they're like vibes based things that we made this little change that I think completely fixes it, which is interesting. Which was that we have like the swing animation problem, where like because you can swing your tool or your weapon or whatever back to back, you can like swing. There's this problem with the timing of the animations where like the first swing animation looks like it's slower because the follow through of it eats into the next swing, which then has to be faster, right? And so in the alpha, you know, our players were like, I don't like how the first swing takes forever and then suddenly I start swinging
stuff
really
around
fast.
that.
Yeah. When really like there's, you know, if your weapon says 0.5 seconds, then there's exactly 0.5 seconds between the time you click the mouse and when you hit the thing. And then there's exactly 0.5 seconds until the next hit and the next hit and the next hit.
Yeah, but this is it gets back to that idea that we talked about like forgiveness mechanics and level head and stuff, right? Is it doesn't matter what the numbers are because people don't experiance time.
You can't feel it.
Right?
People experience what it feels like.
Yep.
And it's true. Like the first swing is visually slower because that's just how it has to work. And we also had some comments about canceling your cast. Like if you start swinging, you know, how do you cancel it? All you do is you just like start moving, or like there's a bunch of ways to cancel it. But because it was only conveyed through a visual animation on the character, then the connection between like what you were doing and how long your swing was taking and whether you were swinging, it was like a little bit ambiguous. And so literally all we did is we just added this little cast bar that's next to the character as an experiment to see. And then suddenly it's just perfectly clear how long your swing is taking, and it's perfectly clear whether you are swinging or not, and all those issues just evaporate.
Yep.
Right? So like no actual change to what the character is doing at all, just like a little visual cue next to the character that makes it more clear.
Because we needed to basically force the player's experience of the time to match the actual time, which you can do by having a simplified model of it that's just a bar that just is very obviously moving at the same rate each time it refills, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just tons of little things like that we haven't really gotten to then like test those with a larger group like this. So I'm excited to see kind of.
They also had an early version of the controls too. Even just the PC controls, because those have shifted significantly. Because I think
all
at
the
that
controls
time,
have been updated like multiple times.
just everything. Because I think at that time during the alpha, which was a year, was that a year ago or 2 years ago? It was a year ago, right?
It was October 23.
Yep.
Yeah.
23. Okay.
2023.
Right. Yeah. So a year and a half ago.
Some change.
Yeah. Because I think at that time we also had a more, just like kind of a little more complicated and confusing way of switching between like your
You would sort of swap
weapon versus
what your hotbar was looking at.
Yeah, you'd like swap hotbars kind of. So it was like this weird kind of like.
I think we got rid of that before the
alpha?
alpha.
Okay.
Yeah, because that was basically trying to solve the problem of when you're using a controller. Having this many different hotbar items can be weird. And so it was largely a controller problem of like you would switch between modes, like either you're selecting your tools or selecting your combat items.
Yeah, so you like switch first and then use the same buttons to then have like, depending on which one you were swapped into, you'd have different outcomes.
Yeah.
Which then was it was easy to find yourself in the wrong one like all the time, you know, like not doing the expected thing.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, we've gone through so many iterations of so many things, and we haven't really gotten to like get a bunch of feedback from players on all of it. And we're about to.
Now we will.
So
I'm excited.
That's crazy. Well, honestly, like I think we should probably just wrap the podcast here, because if we take a question, it'll be a half hour, and we got so much shit to do.
Mainly I just got to play. That's what I got to do.
Yeah, Sam's got to play the game, and it's going to take 40 hours.
Yep.
So he's got to get to it. So we're gonna wrap there, and the next episode we'll be recording during the beta, and we'll have a lot more to say about what's actually happening and how people are receiving the game.
Yep. Did we nail it, or did we whiff it?
We'll find out.
But also, it doesn't matter because it's a beta. We still got weeks and weeks to fix stuff. So that's the whole point, right? So that's all the time we have. So I'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. Go over to the App Store and pre-order, and head on over to Google Play and pre-register. Do all that stuff, and it'll help boost the game up the charts, and it'll help it have a successful launch. We'd appreciate it. So thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye.